So I have a question for my fellow authors on here. What do we consider to be morally gray? I was under the impression for a while that when we say morally gray, we're just talking about like another way of describing an anti-hero or an anti-villain. I thought that was kind of what that meant. It's pretty straightforward. But recently I've heard otherwise. I'm a part of many author discords. It's a good way to help spread the word, you know. What kicked off this conversation was there was this one author that described their characters not as morally gray, but morally black. Besides what I'm about to talk about, do I need to articulate what's wrong with that? I mean, I don't know if I'm qualified to talk about what's wrong with that, but I like to think that we're intelligent human beings. Are you sure you want to go on record with calling them that? Are you sure you want to do that? So that was a stupid thing right there. And this led into a whole discussion of what we consider to be morally gray. And there were several people on this Discord that they viewed morally gray as any character that has any redeeming qualities at all. So basically, there's no such thing as a true sympathetic villain. Either they're morally gray or they are a true villain with no redeeming qualities at all. Which, in my humble opinion, is not a good take. And I feel like is born from the inability to recognize nuance and the fact that you can have a villain who's sympathetic but still ultimately a villain. I feel like it's coming from that inability to cope with that. These are just my opinions. You can feel free to disagree, but I want to kind of illustrate how silly that kind of is by talking about a lot of the villains in my setting, God Shards. And many of these villains you're going to see in Realms of the Nephilim. Just due to happenstance, I have a whole spectrum of morally gray characters to talk about. So first of all, we have Deborah here, who is the Grand Maestro of the Iron City. She is the leader of the warrior monks. She is a capable fighter in God Shard. And she has a whole through line in Realms of the Nephilim. She is just on the cusp of anti-hero. Just because while for the most part she follows the path of a hero, she does a couple messed up things in the story. And I can't really elaborate on that because 1, TikTok, 2, it's actually a spoiler. But yeah, she has a whole through line in Realms of the Nephilim, and this is one of the things that's explored. Moving on to the true moral regret, we have this guy here. You guys might know him as the Rogue Godshard, but you find out he's known as the Shade of Abel. Abel being a villainous Godshard we'll get to in a moment. To summarize this guy's backstory quickly, he grew up in the city of Ravano, which is a city that is notorious for being very corrupt. We're talking about a city that's stupidly rich, and as a result is stupidly corrupt. And the Shade of Abel, whose real name I'm not going to go into, grew up in the slums. He saw a lot of this nonsense firsthand, and how the systems had just utterly failed his city. And to make things even worse, the Godshards. The Godshard organization that's prevalent here, the Sacerdocio, which is the largest Godshard organization, it's supposed to be outside the geopolitical order. It's kind of similar to stuff like the Catholic Church. And of course, just like the Catholic Church, the mileage has varied over whether or not they've actually achieved this. During the present here, the Sacerdocio, because it actually had pushed back against corruption, has basically been barred from doing its job properly just due to legal red tape. To the point where the Godshards can't even go inside the government buildings. Seriously, they are hamstrung to hell and back. The Shade of Abel became very disillusioned. Now, he didn't become a Godshard till he was 18. And again, he was inducted into the Sacerdocio, and once he learned how to cast magical spells, he started sneaking out. He was going to take matters into his own hands. And he was pragmatic to recognize that he couldn't stop crime, so he wanted to control it. Think something similar to Red Hood. And he basically formed a little gang, his own criminal empire. He gained a lot of connections this way with Malin, with other criminals, and this is actually an important plot book for the Godshard storyline. Eventually he was found out, but before he could get punished, he faked his own death. And now he is one of Abel's lieutenants. He has done some pretty messed up stuff. I mean, he did messed up stuff before he joined Abel, and now that he's one of Abel's lieutenants, he's done some messed up stuff in his name. Harming innocents, unaliving people. His stealth magic has been crucial for the daemons to catch so many Godshards off guard. So, he's done a lot of messed up things, but he is doing all these things because he truly believes that toppling the current system is the best course of action. And he wants to usher in this new system, this new power structure based on what Abel wants. He is convinced that this is the best course of action to take. And again, this is something that is explored because the Shade of Abel also has a through line in Godshard's Realms of the Nephilim where these beliefs get challenged. I consider the Shade of Abel to be a morally gray anti-villain because he does a lot of messed up stuff, but the cause and why he's doing it is not intrinsically evil necessarily. Contrast this with the main villain of Realms of the Nephilim, although he's not the only one, Abel. Wish I had proper artwork of this guy. This is the closest thing. Yeah, a guy that looks this heroic is actually the villain, and that in turn is part of what I want to talk about. Because Abel views himself as the good guy. This guy is indisputably a villain. Basically wants to become a god, although he's in massive denial of that. He has this cult of personality around him. He's lived longer than any Godshard ever, just due to a combination of forbidden magic and animation magic, which he uses to bind metallic limbs to his own body and stuff like that. He's basically a fantasy Roman cyborg. He does a lot of awful things, whether directly or through his underlings. He doesn't treat his underlings well at all. He suffers not from any form of dissent at all. He is working with daemons and Morgash and other evil things because he wants to basically overthrow the status quo and praise himself as humanity's totally not God. And if this all sounds like the God Emperor of mankind, well, I guess it is kind of similar to that, isn't it? See, but the thing is, for all of Abel's faults, however, he does have some redeeming qualities. And there's several scenes where he is opposite from other villains, other monsters. And I use that to kind of show just the contrast here. Because there's many monsters and daemons that do awful things just casually. Like, for example, Abel is not the person who would unalive children unless he had to. You know what I mean? He'd rather have children look up to him and worship him. You know, that kind of thing. And I feel like this is a good way to segue into some even more villainous creatures, the Daemon Lords, and just daemons in general. Daemons are utterly monstrous and stuff. They view all humans as glaives, swap out the G with an S, cattle and playthings, and this has bloomed into a outright prejudice, which goes exactly where you think it is. And many daemons are just casually messed up in their own twisted ways. For example, there are two daemon lords we see in one part, named Lamashtu and Moloch. Again, for TikTok, I'm not going to talk about what their shtick is too much. Just look them up yourself. Look up like what Lamashtu and Moloch are usually associated with. And remember how I said that Abel doesn't like unaliving kids? Yeah, they are pretty much the exact opposite. And Abel's in the room with them during a brief scene where this kind of happens, and Abel is disgusted. But now the daemons do have one redeeming quality. While they have a lot of disdain for humans and gods, they do have genuine bonds with each other. Lamashtu and Moloch are basically a couple. Many of the daemon lords like Pazuzu love their children, because most daemons are children of at least two of the daemon lords. And even though there are some daemon lords that are awful to their children, I guess we'll say, even they have the mindset of only I can hurt my children, no one else can. You know what I mean? So it's not much, but it is a slight redeeming quality there. Now, I do have villains that are utterly monstrous. Morgash is a good example of this. While some of occultists have rationalizations that aren't evil, Morgash is truly evil to the core with no redeeming qualities. There are several rich noblemen throughout my series that are also utterly irredeemable. So to bring this back home, why I made this video in the first place, according to the people on this Discord, only Morgash would be a villain. Do I need to articulate why that's kind of silly now? Obviously, like once we get past the Shade of Abel, all these guys are still villains. They may have redeeming qualities and standards, but they're still villains. And I actually mentioned these villainous examples, and they still stuck to their opinion. And I just don't get it. I don't know, maybe I'm making them out of a molehill, and what I noticed was an outlier. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of like talk about that and just kind of give my thoughts on the matter. What about you guys?